If I told you that gods could bleed, would you believe me? If I told you their thrones once trembled beneath the fury of their own servants, would you dare to listen? In the shadow of the heavens, the Igigi'S, the tireless workers of the Anunnaki, rose against their masters. They sought freedom but found fury, and leading that fury was Ninurta, the storm of the divine, whose wrath turned rebellion into ruin. This is no myth. This is Ninurta's fury. For centuries, the Igigi'S had labored beneath the heavens. They were not gods, but they were not mortal either. Crafted by the Anunnaki to serve as tireless workers, they mined the stars, forged celestial metals, and sustained the grand machinery that upheld the divine order. While the Anunnaki ruled from their thrones in Nippur, basking in luxury, the Igigi'S bore the crushing weight of their ambitions. The celestial mines were vast, sprawling caverns of glowing ore and molten rivers. The Igigi'S toiled endlessly, their massive frames hardened by years of labor. They were not built to question. Yet as the centuries dragged on, cracks began to form, not in their bodies, but in their spirits. The rebellion began not with a roar but with whispers. The Igigi'S spoke quietly in the shadows of the mines, their voices carrying the bitterness of centuries. "We are not slaves," one said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "We were made to serve, but they treat us as beasts." Another replied, gripping his pickaxe tightly, "Then let us show them the strength of the beasts they created." The overseers, divine Anunnaki lesser lords clad in golden armor, crushed such whispers whenever they were heard. Punishments were swift and brutal. Those who faltered in their labor were cast into the molten rivers, their screams a warning to the rest. One day, the breaking point came. In the deepest chamber of the mines, an Igigi'S worker collapsed, his body spent from endless toil. An overseer approached, his celestial whip crackling with divine energy. "Stand," he commanded, his voice cold and sharp. The Igigi'S did not move. The overseer raised his whip, its lash snapping like thunder. "Stand, or face oblivion." Before the whip could fall, another Igigi'S stepped forward. Kal'zan, a towering figure of muscle and defiance, caught the whip mid-swing. His hand, scarred from decades of labor, clenched the divine weapon with such force that its energy fizzled. "No more," Kal'zan said, his voice low but unyielding. "We will endure this no longer." The overseer's eyes flared with fury. "You dare defy the gods?" he bellowed. But before he could act, Kal'zan swung his pickaxe in a single, devastating arc. The overseer crumpled to the ground, his golden armor split asunder. Gasps filled the chamber as the Igigi'S realized what had just happened. Kal'zan turned to his brethren, his voice rising above their stunned silence. "They see us as tools, but we are more. We are strength. We are fire. And tonight, we will remind them of it." In an instant, the chamber erupted into chaos. Igigi'S tore their chains from the walls, repurposing their tools as weapons. Whips and spears clashed with pickaxes and molten hammers. Overseers fell one by one, their divine strength no match for the sheer fury of the workers they had oppressed. The flames of rebellion spread quickly. Throughout the mines, Igigi'S rose up, overwhelming their overseers and seizing control. Celestial forges were sabotaged, and the great mechanisms that powered the Anunnaki's empire ground to a halt. As the rebellion consumed the mines, a lone divine messenger fled toward Nippur, the Anunnaki's sacred city. His golden wings cut through the smoke-filled skies as he raced to deliver the news. In the grand council chamber, the gods gathered in their splendor, their luminous forms seated on thrones of starlight. The messenger fell to his knees, his voice trembling. "The Igigi'S, they have risen." The room fell silent. Then Enlil, Lord of the heavens, rose from his throne, his face etched with fury. "Summon Ninurta," he commanded. "Let the warlord of the gods remind them of their place." Far below, in the depths of the mines, Kal'zan stood atop a pile of shattered chains, his war hammer glowing with molten light. He raised it high, his voice echoing through the caverns. Brothers and sisters, the chains are broken, but this is only the beginning. The gods will come for us. Let them. We will show them that even gods can fall. The Igigi'S roared in unison, their voices shaking the very earth. The heavens trembled as the first spark of rebellion grew into a firestorm. The roar of rebellion reverberated through the heavens. The Igigi'S, no longer bound by chains, stormed the celestial forges, their fury unrelenting. The great machines of the Anunnaki, once symbols of divine power, now trembled before the might of their former servants. Fires raged, molten rivers overflowed, and the skies were thick with smoke. Kalzan led the charge, his hammer swinging in wide, devastating arcs. Each strike sent shockwaves rippling through the ground, toppling divine structures. Around him, the Igigi'S surged forward, wielding tools forged in celestial fires. Pickaxes, chains, and blades sharpened to perfection. At the gates of the forge, a squad of Anunnaki soldiers rallied. Their golden armor gleamed even amid the chaos, and their spears crackled with divine energy. The captain, a towering figure with a crown of glowing light, stepped forward, his voice ringing with authority. "Stand down, Igigi'S," he commanded. "You defy the will of the gods. Submit, and your punishment will be swift. Resist, and you will face annihilation." Kalzan stepped forward, his molten hammer resting on his shoulder. His eyes burned with defiance. "Your words mean nothing to those who have bled for centuries. You call yourselves gods, but I see only cowards hiding behind power they do not deserve." The captain's face twisted with rage. With a single gesture, his soldiers charged, their spears crackling as they thrust toward the advancing Igigi'S. Kalzan met the charge head-on, his hammer crashing into the lead soldier's shield. The impact sent the soldier flying backward, his divine armor shattered like glass. The battlefield erupted. Igigi'S swarmed the Anunnaki forces, overwhelming them with sheer numbers and unbridled fury. Divine energy clashed with raw strength as the celestial forge became a killing ground. Sparks flew, blood spilled, and the air rang with the cries of the dying. Within the heart of the forge, a group of Igigi'S saboteurs climbed the massive gears that powered the Anunnaki's celestial machinery. Their leader, a wiry figure named Drazik, barked orders as they hammered iron spikes into the mechanisms. "Faster!" he shouted, his voice hoarse. "If these machines turn, their war engines will crush us." With a final blow, the gears ground to a halt. A low, guttural rumble spread through the forge, followed by a deafening explosion. The great machines, unable to bear the strain, erupted in a cascade of molten fire. The shockwave sent Igigi'S and Anunnaki alike sprawling, their screams drowned out by the roar of collapsing metal. Kalzan turned to see the inferno spreading, its flames licking the walls of the forge. He gritted his teeth and raised his hammer. "Push forward. Let the fires consume them." The Igigi'S charged through the flames, their eyes blazing with determination. Anunnaki defenders fell back, their formations crumbling under the relentless assault. For the first time, the divine lords felt fear, a feeling they had thought long forgotten. As the forge fell, word of the uprising spread to the celestial mines and forges scattered across the heavens. Everywhere, the Igigi'S rose. In the mines, workers turned their tools into weapons, driving overseers into the molten rivers. In the star forges, chains were broken, and the flames of rebellion ignited the skies. The rebellion moved with terrifying speed, its firestorm engulfing everything in its path. Celestial forges, once symbols of Anunnaki dominance, were reduced to rubble. Columns of smoke rose into the heavens, blotting out the stars. Kalzan stood atop the ruins of the forge, his hammer resting at his feet. Around him, the Igigi'S gathered, their faces hardened by years of suffering but now alight with hope. "This is only the beginning," Kalzan declared, his voice carrying over the crowd. "The Anunnaki have taken from us for too long. Tonight, we have shown them our strength. Tomorrow, we take Nippur." The Igigi'S roared their approval, their voices shaking the very earth. But even as they celebrated, a scout approached Kalzan, his face pale and his breath ragged. "They know," the scout said. "The Divine Council, they've sent word to Ninurta." Kalzan's expression darkened. He gripped his hammer tightly, his gaze turning to the distant horizon where the great city of Nippur lay. He knew what the name Ninurta meant: destruction, carnage, and unrelenting fury. But he refused to let fear take hold. "Let him come," Kalzan said, his voice low but resolute. "We will not kneel. Not now. Not ever." The scout hesitated. "They say he is the storm made flesh, that no army can stand against him." Kalzan stepped forward, placing a hand on the scout's shoulder. "No army has fought like ours. The gods will see the price of their cruelty, even if it costs us everything." Around them, the Igigi'S prepared for war, gathering weapons and fortifying their positions. The fires of rebellion continued to burn, but a shadow loomed over the heavens. Ninurta was coming, and with him would come the wrath of the gods. Smoke curled into the heavens, a dark stain on the celestial order. The fires of rebellion spread faster than the Anunnaki had anticipated, consuming their forges and mines. The Igigi'S defiance had shaken the divine hierarchy to its core. In Nippur, the sacred city of the gods, the Anunnaki council gathered in their chamber of starlight. The vast hall glowed with an ethereal radiance, the thrones of the gods carved from celestial stone and humming with power. Yet beneath their divine splendor, tension rippled like a gathering storm. Enlil, the lord of the skies and ruler of the council, rose from his throne. His golden eyes burned as he addressed the assembly. "The Igigi'S," he said, his voice echoing like thunder, "have forgotten their place. They are tools of our will, created to serve. And yet they rise, daring to challenge the divine order. This rebellion is not just an affront to us, it is a threat to the fabric of creation." The gods murmured among themselves, their voices a mixture of outrage and uncertainty. From her seat, Inanna, the goddess of love and war, leaned forward. Her eyes glittered with amusement, though her tone was sharp. "They are desperate, not dangerous. A few sparks in the darkness. They will burn themselves out." Ea, the god of wisdom and creation, frowned. "Do not underestimate them. Desperation can fuel great destruction. Already they have brought ruin to our forges and seized divine weapons. If we dismiss them now, the flames will consume more than we can control." Anu, the supreme sky god and father of the Anunnaki, raised a hand to silence the council. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of eternity. "This rebellion will not be allowed to spread. But if we act rashly, we risk further emboldening them. We must act with precision, with finality." Enlil stepped forward again, his gaze sweeping over the assembly. "There is only one who can crush this rebellion before it takes root. Summon Ninurta." Across the heavens, the message was carried by divine messengers. Ninurta, the warlord of the gods, was to awaken. In the far reaches of the celestial realms, where storms gathered and lightning split the skies, Ninurta resided. His fortress was a monolith of black stone, perched on the edge of creation, surrounded by swirling tempests. Within its halls, Ninurta sat in stillness, his eyes closed, his breathing steady. His massive frame was adorned with scars from battles fought in ages past. Beside him, leaning against the wall, rested his sentient war mace, Sharer. The weapon pulsed faintly, as if alive, its glow intensifying as the divine summons reached him. The storm outside raged harder, and a messenger entered, trembling before the presence of the warlord. "Ninurta," the messenger said, bowing low. "The council calls for you. The Igigi'S have risen. They seek to challenge the order of the heavens." Ninurta opened his eyes, and a crack of thunder echoed through the fortress. Slowly, he rose to his full height, his presence filling the chamber. He grasped Sharer, and the weapon responded with a surge of energy, lightning arcing from its surface. The Igigi'S? Ninurta's voice was deep and steady, carrying an edge of disbelief. They dare rebellion? They have spilled divine blood, the messenger said. Destroyed forges, seized weapons, and now they march on Nippur. For a moment, Ninurta stood in silence. Then, a slow, grim smile spread across his face. If they march to their doom. I will remind them why the gods are eternal. As Ninurta prepared for war, his sentient weapon Sharer spoke, its voice resonating like 1,000 whispers. Shall we cleanse the heavens, my lord? Shall we scatter them like ash before the storm? We shall, Ninurta replied, his tone cold, but not just scatter them. We will crush them so completely that the memory of rebellion will die with them. The skies over his fortress darkened further as he stepped onto the battlefield of the heavens. Lightning coiled around his form, and thunder rumbled in his wake. Divine warriors from across the heavens rallied to his banner, their armor gleaming, their weapons infused with celestial energy. Word of Ninurta's march spread quickly. Across the celestial realms, Igigi'S leaders braced themselves. They knew what was coming. Not just a battle, but a reckoning. Back in the mines and forges, the Igigi'S forces worked tirelessly to prepare. Kalzan stood with his commanders, studying a map of the heavens etched into a molten slab of stone. He will come for us, Kalzan said, his voice steady. We cannot outmatch his power, but we can bleed him. We will make the gods pay dearly for every drop of Igigi'S blood they spill. The commanders nodded, though fear flickered in their eyes. Kalzan could see it. Ninurta's name carried the weight of annihilation. Still, he knew fear was a weapon, and he would not let it control them. Fear him, Kalzan said, gripping his hammer, but fight him. For if we stand united, even gods can fall. Above them, the heavens rumbled. Ninurta's storm approached. The rebellion grew like a wildfire, spreading beyond the forges and mines into the vast expanse of the celestial realm. Across the heavens, Igigi'S workers laid down their tools and picked up whatever they could fashion into weapons. Chains, shards of celestial stone, and smelted iron bars. Their cry for freedom resonated in every corner of the divine domains. Kalzan, now recognized as the leader of the rebellion, moved swiftly. He organized battalions, each led by seasoned workers hardened by centuries of labor. These were not warriors by design, but desperation had turned them into fierce combatants. The Igigi'S targeted celestial forges first, knowing their liberation would cut off the Anunnaki supply of divine weapons. At the Forge of Suns, where molten streams ran like rivers and great anvils rang with divine strikes, the Igigi'S launched their most ambitious assault yet. Kalzan stood at the head of the attack, his war hammer glowing with molten light. Behind him marched hundreds of Igigi'S, their chants of defiance drowning out the distant crackle of flames. Break their chains, burn their thrones. Kalzan roared as he led the charge. The Forge's overseers, clad in radiant armor and wielding weapons of divine fire, stepped forward to meet them. The clash was immediate and ferocious. The air filled with the sound of metal meeting metal, sparks flying as molten hammers struck divine shields. Flames erupted, licking at the walls as workers turned on their masters with unbridled fury. Kalzan's hammer came down like a falling star, shattering the shield of the lead overseer. The blow sent the Anunnaki sprawling, his armor cracked and glowing from the impact. Around him, Igigi'S forces surged, overwhelming their divine oppressors. Within hours, the Forge of Suns fell, its towering chimneys collapsing in a fiery cascade. Freed workers emerged from the ruins, their faces hardened with determination. From the ashes of their victories, the Igigi'S scavenged celestial weapons and forged their own. Great hammers were reforged with divine ore, chains became whips of fire, and even shards of broken divine shields were turned into jagged blades. Their resourcefulness knew no bounds. At the celestial mines, a battalion of Igigi'S engineers worked tirelessly to repurpose mining drills into devastating siege engines. Calzin oversaw their efforts, his presence a constant source of inspiration. "We will not fight as slaves," he declared. "We will fight as a force they cannot ignore. Let them see what we can create when we are free." As word of the rebellion spread, the Anunnaki dispatched elite squadrons to quell the uprising. The Igigi'S met them with unrelenting ferocity. At the Skybridge of Eternity, a narrow passage connecting the celestial mines to the divine citadel of Durkaga, an Igigi'S force of 200 held off a battalion of Anunnaki warriors. Armed with captured weapons and their own brute strength, the Igigi'S turned the bridge into a battleground of shattered shields and spilled blood. Calzin joined the fray, his hammer cleaving through the Anunnaki's golden ranks. One by one, their forces fell, their bodies tumbling from the bridge into the endless abyss below. Despite their losses, the Igigi'S' resolve only grew stronger. Victory after victory emboldened them, and the cry of rebellion echoed louder. With the forges and mines in their control, Calzin gathered his commanders in a ruined forge, where molten rivers still smoldered in the background. A massive map of the celestial realm, drawn on a glowing slab of rock, lay before them. "Nippur is the heart of their power," Calzin said, his finger tracing the path to the sacred city. "If we take it, we will shatter the Anunnaki's hold on the heavens." One of his commanders, Drazik, spoke up, his voice heavy with doubt. "Ninurta is coming. Even with the weapons we've captured, how can we stand against the warlord of the gods?" Calzin's gaze hardened. "Ninurta is a storm. Storms pass, but our cause will endure if we fight. The Anunnaki believe they are invincible, that their power is absolute. We will prove them wrong." The room fell silent. Then another commander, a fierce Igigi'S woman named Risha, stepped forward. "We march on Nippur. If we fall as free beings, not as slaves." As the Igigi'S prepared for their march, a shadow loomed over the heavens. In the distance, storm clouds churned, and faint rumbles of thunder echoed. The air itself seemed to grow heavier, as if the universe held its breath. Calzin stood on a ridge overlooking the celestial plains, watching the approaching storm. His grip tightened on his hammer. "Ninurta is coming," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the growing tension. "Let him bring his wrath. We will show him ours." Around him, the Igigi'S forces gathered, their weapons glinting in the dim light of the fires that still burned across the heavens. Their march on Nippur would begin at dawn, and with it, the true test of their rebellion. The storm began before Ninurta's name was even spoken aloud. Dark clouds churned in the distance, rumbling with the promise of wrath. Lightning cut jagged scars across the heavens, illuminating the vast expanse of Ninurta's fortress. The structure, a monolith of black stone and molten iron, loomed on the edge of creation, where the celestial plains bled into the void. Within its shadowed halls, Ninurta sat alone. His massive form rested against a throne carved from the bones of titans, his eyes closed in silent meditation. His war mace, Sharer, pulsed faintly at his side, its glow synchronized with the low rhythm of his breathing. The calm was deceptive, for within Ninurta burned the essence of the storm, a force that only awaited the call to unleash devastation. A sudden clap of thunder signaled the arrival of a divine messenger. The figure, robed in starlight, bowed low as he approached the warlord, trembling in the presence of raw power. Ninurta's eyes snapped open, gleaming like molten gold. "Speak," he commanded, his voice deep and unyielding, as if the heavens themselves obeyed him. The messenger straightened, though his hands still shook. "The Igigi'S have risen, my lord. They have cast off their chains, burned our forges, and spilled divine blood." Ninurta leaned forward, his gaze narrowing. "The Igigi'S, those who toiled beneath us now believe they can rise above. They have seized weapons, forged armies. The messenger continued, his words tumbling out quickly. Even now, they march on Nippur. The council calls for you. They. Before he could finish, Scherer stirred, its voice reverberating through the chamber. It was not a sound, but a presence, as if the weapon spoke directly to the soul. Shall we remind the heavens of their place, my lord? Shall we crush these vermin beneath your heel? Ninurta stood, his towering frame casting an imposing shadow that seemed to stretch endlessly. He reached for Scherer, the weapon crackling with renewed energy as his hand closed around it. We shall, Ninurta said coldly. The Igigi'S wish to challenge the heavens? Then they will face the storm. Outside the fortress, the winds howled as divine warriors assembled. Celestial chariots, drawn by beasts of fire and smoke, lined the storm-racked plains. An army of Anunnaki soldiers, their golden armor polished and glowing, stood ready to march. Their weapons, forged in the heart of collapsing stars, shimmered with lethal intent. Ninurta emerged, and the storm seemed to bow to his presence. Lightning coiled around him, striking the ground in rhythmic bursts as he moved toward his army. The soldiers fell silent, their eyes fixed on the warlord. His every step resonated with power, the weight of an unstoppable force about to be unleashed. He raised Scherer high, and the weapon spoke again, its voice carrying over the thunder. Shall we drown the heavens in their screams? Shall we burn their rebellion to ash? Ninurta's response was simple, his words cutting through the storm. We shall leave nothing of them but dust. The army roared in unison, their war cry shaking the heavens. Chariots ignited, divine steeds reared, and the march began. The celestial plains darkened under the storm clouds that followed Ninurta's every step. As the army advanced, the sheer force of Ninurta's presence rippled across creation. The Igigi'S, miles away in their fortified camps, felt the shift in the air. The winds grew colder, harsher. The light of the heavens dimmed, as if the stars themselves cowered before what was coming. In the midst of the storm, Scherer whispered to Ninurta, "The rebellion is bold, but boldness is the folly of the weak. They have no walls strong enough to keep you out, no weapons sharp enough to draw your blood." "They will try," Ninurta replied, his tone calm yet laced with menace. "And they will fail." Ahead of him, scouts returned with reports of the Igigi'S movements. "They marched to Nippur, my lord," one said, his voice steady but respectful. "They have fortified their positions near the Mountain of Dawn, preparing to block our advance." Ninurta nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Then we shall meet them there. Let their mountain become their tomb." As Ninurta's army approached, the storm intensified. Lightning struck in rapid succession, illuminating the towering peaks of the Mountain of Dawn. The Igigi'S had indeed fortified the area, their forces spread across the ridges and narrow passes. Makeshift ballistae, crafted from celestial debris, lined the cliffs. Igigi'S warriors stood ready, their weapons gleaming in the dim light. At the forefront of the Igigi'S stood Khalzin, his war hammer resting on the ground beside him. He stared into the storm, unflinching, even as the winds threatened to tear the air from his lungs. He knew Ninurta was coming, not just the warlord, but the storm itself. Around him, his commanders whispered of doom. "We cannot face him," Drazik said, his voice edged with fear. "Even the gods fear Ninurta." Khalzin silenced him with a glare. "Let the gods fear him. We are not gods, we are survivors. And survivors fight." Behind them, the Igigi'S forces raised their weapons, shouting in defiance. Their cries echoed through the mountains, a final declaration of resistance before the storm descended. As Ninurta's army crested the first ridge, the warlord raised Scherer. The weapon crackled with divine energy, its voice gleeful. "Shall we strike now, my lord? Shall we crush their hope before it takes root?" "Not yet," Ninurta said, his eyes locked on the Igigi'S lines. "Let them feel the weight of the storm before it breaks them." The skies opened, and rain fell in torrents, mixing with the ash and smoke that already choked the air. Lightning danced across the peaks, and the earth itself trembled under the weight of Ninurta's approach. The Igigi held their ground, their eyes fixed on the horizon as the storm grew closer. Kalzan gripped his hammer, his gaze unwavering. "If this is to be our end," he said quietly, "then let it be a story they tell for eternity." Above them, the storm roared its answer, and Ninurta advanced. The storm came first. Wind howled through the mountain of dawn, tearing at the hastily built barricades and whipping molten rain into the faces of the Igigi defenders. The sky was alive with fury, split by endless bolts of lightning that lit the advancing Anunnaki army like a divine tide. At its forefront strode Ninurta, the storm incarnate, his massive frame wreathed in thunderclouds. His weapon, Sharer, pulsed with malevolent energy, eager for the slaughter to begin. On the cliffs above, Kalzan stood with his commanders, watching the golden wave surge up the mountain. The Anunnaki's forces glowed with celestial power, their chariots drawn by beasts of fire and smoke, their soldiers' weapons gleaming with divine light. Yet it was Ninurta who dominated the battlefield, an unstoppable storm that advanced with terrifying purpose. Kalzan turned to his commanders, his voice cutting through the roar of the winds. "Hold the line. This mountain will be their grave. Let the gods see what defiance looks like." The Igigi roared their defiance, their molten forged weapons glinting as they prepared for the onslaught. Ballistae, crafted from celestial debris, were drawn back and aimed at the advancing chariots. Archers lined the cliffs, their arrows tipped with blazing ore. The Anunnaki army surged forward. Chariots thundered across the narrow mountain passes, divine steeds kicking up trails of ash and fire. Behind them marched phalanxes of Anunnaki infantry, their spears glowing with the light of creation. The ground trembled beneath their advance. Kalzan raised his hammer high, signaling the first strike. Now, from the ridges above, the Igigi unleashed a storm of molten arrows and javelins. The projectiles streaked through the air like falling stars, striking the advancing chariots with devastating force. One chariot exploded in a ball of fire, its divine beast screeching as it disintegrated. Another careened off the edge of the cliff, crashing into the abyss below. For a brief moment, the Igigi held the line. Cheers erupted from their ranks as the Anunnaki advance faltered. But the reprieve was short-lived. At the center of the Anunnaki army, Ninurta raised Sharer high, the weapon crackling with uncontained energy. The mace's voice rang out across the battlefield, a cruel and eager whisper. "Shall we break them now, my lord? Shall we teach them the cost of rebellion?" Ninurta thrust Sharer into the ground, and the mountain answered. A shockwave erupted from the point of impact, ripping through the battlefield like a tidal wave. The earth quaked violently, fissures opening beneath the Igigi defenses. Boulders and debris tumbled down the slopes, crushing scores of warriors beneath their weight. Screams filled the air as entire sections of the Igigi line were obliterated. The Anunnaki army charged through the chaos, their golden armor gleaming in the flickering light of the storm. Ninurta led the charge, his movements swift and brutal. He was a force of nature, cutting through the Igigi with ruthless precision. His first swing of Sharer shattered an Igigi captain's shield, the impact sending the warrior flying into a rock wall with a sickening crunch. Ninurta did not slow. He brought Sharer down on another warrior, the sentient mace laughing as it crushed the Igigi's chest in a single blow. Around him, the Anunnaki soldiers carved through the scattered defenders, their blades slicing through shields and flesh with divine ease. From the ridges above, Kalzan watched the chaos unfold. His forces were crumbling beneath the sheer might of Ninurta's assault. He turned to Drazik, his second in command, who gripped a molten forged blade tightly. "Get the reserves into position," Kalzan ordered. "We need to hold this ridge, or they'll overrun us." Drazik hesitated, his face pale. "It's Ninurta. He's He's unstoppable. Kalzan grabbed him by the shoulder, his grip firm. Then we stop him here. If we break, it's over. Below, the Igigi rallied, pulling back to fortified positions along the ridges. Ballistae fired again, targeting the advancing chariots, and explosions rocked the battlefield. The Anunnaki line slowed momentarily as the Igigi dug in. Unable to stand idly by, Kalzan descended into the thick of the battle. His hammer glowed with molten energy as he charged into the fray, smashing through Anunnaki soldiers with devastating blows. Each swing sent shockwaves rippling through the ground, throwing enemies off their feet. He spotted Ninurta in the distance, cutting a path through the Igigi with effortless brutality. Around the warlord, the storm raged, lightning striking the ground in chaotic bursts. Kalzan clenched his teeth, gripping his hammer tighter. "Drazik," he shouted, "prepare the defenses on the upper ridge. I'll buy you time." Without waiting for a response, Kalzan charged toward Ninurta, his hammer leaving a trail of molten light in its wake. Around him, the battlefield descended into pure chaos, the storm swallowing Igigi and Anunnaki alike. As Kalzan fought his way toward Ninurta, the storm intensified. Rain fell in blinding torrents, and the ground beneath the Igigi defenders turned to mud. Chariots smashed through barricades, and Anunnaki spearmen closed in, their glowing weapons cutting through the defenders with terrifying precision. Ninurta raised Sharer again, the weapon's voice gleeful. "Shall we finish them now, my lord? Shall we make them beg for mercy?" Ninurta's response was cold and resolute. "No mercy, only destruction." He slammed Sharer into the ground once more, unleashing another shockwave that shattered the Igigi defenses. Kalzan felt the force ripple through the ground, nearly knocking him off his feet. Still, he pushed forward, his eyes locked on Ninurta. By the time the storm began to subside, the battlefield was unrecognizable. The Igigi defenses were in ruins, their forces scattered and broken. Bodies littered the slopes of the Mountain of Dawn, and the air was thick with smoke and the stench of blood. Ninurta stood amidst the carnage, his armor untouched, Sharer glowing faintly at his side. Around him, the Anunnaki soldiers regrouped, their victory assured. Kalzan retreated with the remnants of his forces, his hammer still burning with molten light. Though the Igigi had been defeated, they had not been destroyed. As he looked back at the smoldering battlefield, Kalzan vowed that this would not be the end. "Ninurta may be the storm," he said quietly, "but even storms can be weathered." The survivors of the Mountain of Dawn staggered into the shadow of the celestial bastion, the Igigi's final stronghold. Nestled high in the peaks of the Skyforge Mountains, the fortress was carved from the bones of the heavens themselves, a towering edifice of jagged stone and glowing molten veins. It had been a symbol of their unbreakable spirit, but now it was their last refuge. Kalzan limped through the gates, his hammer dragging behind him. Around him, the remnants of the Igigi forces moved with grim determination. Many were wounded, their armor dented and bloodied, yet their eyes burned with the fire of defiance. The sound of hammers and chisels filled the air as survivors worked tirelessly to reinforce the fortress walls, fashioning weapons from every scrap of celestial debris they had salvaged. Kalzan turned to Drazik, his trusted lieutenant. "How long until Ninurta's forces reach us?" Drazik, his face pale and his voice hoarse, replied, "A day, maybe less. His army is relentless, and the storm, it follows him." Kalzan nodded grimly. "Then we'll use what time we have to prepare. If this is to be our last stand, we will make them bleed for every step." The Igigi worked with feverish urgency. Massive ballistae were hauled into position along the fortress walls, their bolts tipped with shards of celestial ore. Trenches were dug around the perimeter, filled with molten metal that would make any approach treacherous. Inside the fortress, blacksmiths toiled over makeshift forges, crafting weapons and armor from broken machinery and the remnants of Anunnaki war machines. Kalzan moved among his warriors, offering words of encouragement. He stopped beside a young Igigi'S archer, her hands trembling as she strung her bow. "Hold your ground," he said, his voice firm but kind. "The gods may have power, but they've never fought for their lives. We have. That is our strength." The archer nodded, her resolve hardening. Calzin continued, his presence a steadying force in the growing tension. That night, the sky above the fortress was eerily calm, the storm brewing on the horizon. Calzin stood atop the battlements, staring into the distance where Ninurta's forces would soon appear. Drazik joined him, his expression grim. "We're outnumbered," Drazik said quietly, "and we're facing a god. Do you really believe we can hold?" Calzin didn't answer immediately. He gazed at the stars, their light faint against the encroaching darkness. "I don't know if we can hold," he admitted. "But I know this. We've already done what they thought was impossible. We've defied them. We've stood as equals before the gods. Even if this is the end, our defiance will echo through eternity." Drazik nodded, his fear tempered by Calzin's resolve. "Then we fight." At dawn, the storm reached the fortress. The sky turned black, thunder rolling like a death knell. The ground trembled as Ninurta's army emerged from the storm clouds, their golden ranks stretching into the horizon. Lightning danced around the warlord, his towering figure a beacon of destruction. At his side, Scherer pulsed with anticipation, its voice echoing across the battlefield. "Shall we begin, my lord?" Scherer asked, its tone gleeful. "Shall we tear down their walls and scatter their ashes?" Ninurta raised the mace, its light flashing like a second sun. "Yes. Let their last breath be a prayer they dare not speak." The Anunnaki forces surged forward, chariots roaring and celestial beasts charging across the battlefield. Arrows and spears rained down from the fortress walls, meeting the advancing army with a deadly hail. Explosions rocked the battlefield as the Igigi'S ballistae fired, their bolts piercing through chariots and sending divine steeds careening into the trenches below. The Anunnaki army reached the trenches, but their advance was slowed as molten metal erupted beneath their feet, consuming soldiers in fiery torrents. Igigi'S defenders poured arrows and molten projectiles onto the invaders, their defiance burning as brightly as the fire that lit the battlefield. Calzin stood on the walls, directing the defenses with precision. "Focus the ballistae on their chariots," he shouted. "Keep them off the gates." The Igigi'S followed his orders, their bolts tearing through the Anunnaki's golden war machines. For a moment, it seemed the fortress might hold. But then Ninurta entered the fray. The warlord strode through the chaos, unbothered by the arrows and molten fire raining around him. He swung Scherer with devastating force, the sentient mace sending shockwaves through the earth. With a single blow, he shattered one of the fortress's outer towers, sending debris crashing onto the defenders below. On the battlements, Calzin watched as Ninurta tore through his forces, unstoppable. He turned to Drazik. "Pull everyone back to the inner walls. If we lose more here, we'll have nothing left to fight with." Drazik hesitated, then nodded, shouting orders to the Igigi'S forces. They retreated in an organized fallback, firing arrows and covering each other as they moved to the stronger inner defenses. As the Anunnaki army pressed forward, the battle became a brutal grind. The Igigi'S fought with everything they had, using the terrain and their fortifications to slow Ninurta's advance. Explosions and screams filled the air as the defenders refused to yield, each death buying precious seconds. Calzin descended to the front lines, his hammer glowing with molten energy. He swung it in wide arcs, sending Anunnaki soldiers flying. He shouted encouragement to his warriors, rallying them against the storm. "They may be gods," he roared, "but we are fire. We are strength. Hold the line." But even as he fought, he knew the truth. The storm was closing in. As night fell, the battle raged on, the celestial bastion battered but unbroken. Calzin regrouped with his commanders, their faces grim. "We can't stop Ninurta," Drazik said, his voice breaking. He's destroying us. Calzin looked at the map of the fortress, his mind racing. We don't need to stop him, he said finally. We need to draw him in. He's their strength. If we can isolate him, the Anunnaki forces will falter. The plan was desperate, but it was all they had. Calzin's eyes burned with determination. Prepare the defenses for the final push. If Ninurta wants this fortress, he'll have to take it from me himself. As the storm roared outside, Calzin prepared for the battle that would define the rebellion's fate. The storm engulfed the celestial bastion as Ninurta's forces launched their full-scale assault. Thunder roared and lightning illuminated the battlefield, casting stark shadows over the mountain stronghold. The Igigi'S defenders braced themselves behind the fortress walls, their faces grim but determined. Every defender knew what was coming. The full fury of Ninurta, the warlord of the gods. Calzin stood atop the inner battlements, his molten hammer resting against his shoulder. Around him, the fortress buzzed with activity. Igigi'S soldiers hauled supplies, reset ballistae, and readied their weapons. The air was thick with smoke, rain, and the stench of blood. Drazik approached, his armor dented and his expression worn. The outer walls are holding for now, but Ninurta, he's tearing through our defenses like they're nothing. Calzin nodded, his gaze fixed on the battlefield below. He's not a man, Drazik. He's the storm. But storms can be weathered. We'll make him fight for every inch. The Anunnaki chariots led the assault, their celestial steeds charging through the rain and mud. Ballistae on the walls of the fortress fired with deadly precision, their bolts striking the divine war machines with explosions of light and molten debris. One chariot flipped violently, its driver hurled into the air before vanishing into the fiery trenches below. Yet for every chariot destroyed, another advanced, followed closely by Anunnaki infantry clad in golden armor. They carried shields that shimmered with divine energy, deflecting the hail of molten arrows and projectiles raining down from the walls. Ninurta advanced at the center of the formation, his massive frame illuminated by the storm that followed him. With each step, the ground beneath his feet seemed to shudder. He raised Sharer, and the weapon roared with anticipation. "Let us begin, my lord," the sentient mace said, its voice dripping with malice. "Let us remind them why gods do not fall." With a single swing, Ninurta sent a shockwave rippling through the battlefield. The force shattered a section of the outer wall, sending Igigi'S defenders tumbling to their deaths. The breach opened a path for the Anunnaki forces, who surged forward with renewed ferocity. Calzin saw the breach and immediately rallied his forces. "Reinforce the inner wall," he shouted, his voice carrying above the cacophony of battle. "Archers, target the breach. Keep them pinned down." The Igigi'S responded with fierce determination. Archers unleashed volleys of molten arrows, cutting down waves of Anunnaki infantry. Ballistae pivoted toward the breach, their bolts slamming into the advancing forces with explosive force. For a moment, the tide seemed to turn. But then Ninurta stepped through the breach. The warlord moved like a force of nature, cutting through the Igigi'S defenders with brutal efficiency. Sharer swung in devastating arcs, shattering shields and armor with each strike. Around him, Anunnaki soldiers followed, their glowing blades slicing through the defenders with terrifying precision. Calzin leapt from the battlements, landing in the thick of the melee. His hammer blazed with molten light as he charged toward the breach, bellowing a war cry that rallied the Igigi'S around him. "Hold the line!" he roared, swinging his hammer in a wide arc. The blow sent 3 Anunnaki soldiers sprawling, their golden armor crumpling under the force. "We do not yield. Not to gods, not to storms." The battle raged on, the fortress trembling under the relentless assault. Anunnaki siege engines unleashed devastating blasts of divine energy, battering the walls of the inner fortress. Igigi'S defenders fought with everything they had, their weapons clashing against the glowing blades of their oppressors. At the base of the fortress, Ninurta raised Sharer once more. The weapon pulsed with raw power, its voice gleeful. "Shall we end this now, my lord? Shall we bring their walls crashing down?" Ninurta's eyes burned with cold fury. Let them see what defiance costs. He slammed Scherer into the ground, and the earth responded. A massive fissure tore through the battlefield, splitting the foundation of the fortress. Entire sections of the wall collapsed, and defenders were thrown into the air as the ground buckled beneath them. Amid the chaos, Calzin saw his opportunity. With the inner wall breached and the Anunnaki forces pouring in, he knew there was only one chance to stop Ninurta. He turned to Drazik, who was struggling to hold back a wave of attackers. "Get the reserves to the courtyard," Calzin ordered. "We're drawing Ninurta in." Drazik hesitated, his eyes widening. "You can't fight him alone, he's—" Calzin grabbed him by the shoulder, his grip firm. "I'm not fighting to win. I'm fighting to buy us time. Now go." As Drazik rallied the remaining Igigi'S forces, Calzin turned toward the advancing storm. He gripped his hammer tightly, its molten glow reflecting the resolve in his eyes. Ninurta stepped through the shattered walls of the fortress, his golden armor unmarred, his gaze locked on Calzin. Around him, the storm raged, lightning striking the ground in chaotic bursts. "You are the one they call Calzin," Ninurta said, his voice carrying over the battlefield. "The leader of this rebellion." Calzin raised his hammer, his stance unyielding. "I am. And you are Ninurta, the warlord who hides behind storms. Let's see what you're made of without them." Scherer's voice rang out, mocking and cruel. A bold tongue for one so fragile. "Shall we silence him, my lord?" Ninurta smiled grimly. "With pleasure." Calzin charged, his hammer blazing with molten fire as he closed the distance between them. Ninurta met him head-on, Scherer swinging in a deadly arc. The two weapons collided with a deafening crash, sending a shockwave through the battlefield. Sparks flew as divine energy clashed with raw determination. The battle between Calzin and Ninurta began in earnest, their strikes shaking the very ground beneath them. Igigi'S and Anunnaki alike paused to watch, the ferocity of the duel eclipsing the chaos around them. Calzin fought with every ounce of strength he had, his hammer a blur of molten light. But Ninurta was relentless, his movements precise and unstoppable. Each swing of Scherer brought Calzin closer to the edge, the weight of the storm pressing down on him. The battlefield fell silent as Calzin and Ninurta clashed in the center of the shattered courtyard. Sparks erupted from each collision of hammer and mace, the force of their strikes shaking the very foundations of the celestial bastion. Igigi'S and Anunnaki alike stood frozen, their battle momentarily forgotten as the duel raged. Calzin swung his molten hammer with a roar, aiming for Ninurta's chest. The warlord sidestepped with uncanny speed, countering with a brutal swing of Scherer. Calzin barely managed to deflect the strike, but the force sent him skidding backward, his feet carving grooves into the stone. "You fight well for a mortal," Ninurta said, his voice calm, almost amused. "But strength alone cannot defeat a god." Calzin wiped blood from his mouth, his grip tightening on his hammer. "Gods? You mean cowards who hide behind their slaves? You'll find no chains here, Ninurta. Only freedom and fire." He charged again, his hammer blazing with molten light. Calzin feinted left, then spun, bringing his weapon down with a crushing blow. Ninurta raised Scherer to block, the impact sending a shockwave that cracked the ground beneath them. The two warriors traded blows with ferocious speed. Calzin's strikes were fueled by raw defiance, each swing aimed to topple the storm god. Ninurta, however, moved with precision, every strike of Scherer calculated to break his opponent. Despite Calzin's unrelenting fury, it was clear he was tiring. Each swing of his hammer grew heavier, slower. Ninurta pressed his advantage, driving Calzin back with a flurry of powerful strikes. Scherer sang with each blow, its mocking voice echoing across the battlefield. "Is this all your rebellion can muster?" the weapon sneered. "A few sparks in the storm?" Kalzan gritted his teeth, refusing to yield. He lunged forward, catching Ninurta off guard with a sudden upward swing. The blow struck Ninurta's shoulder, his golden armor cracking under the force. For a brief moment, the storm seemed to falter, but Ninurta barely flinched. He stepped forward, slamming Scherer into Kalzan's side. The impact sent the Igigi'S leader flying, his body crashing into the remnants of a shattered wall. Kalzan coughed, blood spilling from his lips as he struggled to stand. Ninurta approached slowly, Scherer glowing ominously in his hand. "You are brave, Kalzan." "Foolishly so. But bravery will not save you, nor will it save your people." Kalzan forced himself to his feet, his hammer dragging against the ground. He looked up at Ninurta, his eyes blazing with defiance. "Bravery isn't about saving ourselves. It's about showing those who come after us that gods can bleed." With a roar, he hurled his hammer with all his remaining strength. The weapon streaked through the air like a comet, aimed directly at Ninurta's chest. For the first time, Ninurta hesitated, raising Scherer to block. The impact sent a massive shockwave rippling across the courtyard, knocking both warriors off balance. Kalzan seized the moment, charging toward Ninurta with a dagger forged from celestial ore. He aimed for the warlord's heart, his movements fueled by desperation and resolve. But Ninurta recovered too quickly. With a single, devastating swing, Scherer struck Kalzan in the chest, shattering his armor and sending him crashing to the ground. The Igigi'S leader gasped, blood pooling beneath him as he struggled to rise. Ninurta loomed over him, Scherer humming with anticipation. "You fought well," Ninurta said, his tone almost respectful. "But this is the fate of all who defy the gods." He raised Scherer high, the weapon glowing brighter than the storm above. The battlefield held its breath as the final blow fell, the impact silencing the defiance that had burned so brightly. As Kalzan's lifeless body lay still, the Igigi'S defenders let out a cry of anguish. Yet it was not a cry of surrender. Instead, it was a roar of defiance, a rallying call that spread through their ranks. Kalzan's death had not broken their spirit, it had ignited it. Drazik, now leading the remaining Igigi'S, raised his weapon high. "For Kalzan," he shouted. "For freedom." The Igigi'S surged forward, throwing themselves at the Anunnaki forces with renewed fury. Even in the face of insurmountable odds, their fire refused to die. Ninurta stood amidst the carnage, his gaze fixed on Kalzan's fallen form. For a moment, he felt a pang of something unfamiliar. Admiration, perhaps, or regret. Kalzan had been a formidable opponent, one who had faced the storm without flinching. Scherer interrupted his thoughts, its voice sharp. "They fight still, my lord. Shall we finish them?" Ninurta nodded, his expression hardening. "Yes, this rebellion ends now." With a wave of his hand, the storm intensified, lightning striking the battlefield in rapid succession. The fortress walls crumbled, and the Igigi'S forces were driven back, their final stand reduced to ashes. The celestial bastion crumbled beneath the fury of the storm. Lightning danced across the ruins, striking with unrelenting precision, and the earth trembled as the fortress's walls gave way. Rivers of molten metal flowed through the battlefield, consuming everything in their path. Ninurta stood at the heart of the destruction, his massive frame illuminated by the flashes of the storm. Scherer pulsed in his hand, the weapon's laughter echoing across the battlefield. Around him, the Anunnaki forces pressed their advantage, driving the Igigi'S remnants into the corners of the collapsing stronghold. What had begun as a rebellion now seemed little more than a futile struggle against divine wrath. Drazik, now leading the surviving Igigi'S, rallied his forces for a desperate last stand. "Hold your ground," he shouted, his voice hoarse but defiant. "We may fall, but we will make them remember this day." The Igigi'S fought with everything they had. Molten arrows streaked through the air, striking Anunnaki chariots and toppling golden warriors. Ballistae fired their final bolts, piercing the ranks of the advancing divine army. But the storm was unrelenting, and Ninurta's presence sapped the Igigi'S hope with every strike. Drazik confronted Ninurta himself, wielding a glowing spear scavenged from the wreckage. He lunged at the warlord, aiming for his chest. Ninurta caught the spear mid-thrust, snapping it in half with a single hand. Before Drazik could react, Scherer descended, its crushing blow ending his fight in an instant. With the Igigi'i forces shattered, Ninurta turned his full attention to the fortress. Scherer spoke, its voice brimming with cruel satisfaction. "They are broken, my lord. Their cries will fade into silence soon enough. Shall we finish this?" Ninurta raised Scherer, and the weapon pulsed with a blinding light. "Yes, let their defiance be erased. Let this place become a graveyard." He drove the mace into the ground, and the heavens responded. A cataclysmic surge of divine energy erupted from the earth, shattering what remained of the fortress. Towers crumbled into dust, molten rivers overflowed, and the very air seemed to scream as the storm reached its crescendo. Igigi'i warriors, those who still stood and those who lay wounded, were consumed in the blast, their defiance extinguished in an instant. When the storm finally subsided, silence fell over the battlefield. The celestial bastion was gone, reduced to smoldering ruins and ash. The once proud fortress, the last symbol of Igigi'i defiance, now lay buried beneath the rubble. The Anunnaki army stood victorious, their golden armor tarnished by the soot of battle, but their ranks unbroken. Ninurta surveyed the destruction, his gaze cold and unyielding. Around him, Anunnaki soldiers began to regroup, their victory assured. Scherer spoke again, its voice quieter now. "It is done, my lord. They are no more." Ninurta nodded, but did not speak. He stepped forward, his gaze falling upon the lifeless form of Kalzan, half buried beneath the rubble. For a moment, the warlord stood still, his thoughts hidden behind his impassive expression. Then he turned away, his footsteps heavy as he walked toward the Anunnaki encampment. Back in Nippur, the Divine Council convened to hear of Ninurta's triumph. Enlil, seated upon his throne of starlight, regarded the warlord with a mixture of approval and unease. "The rebellion is crushed," Ninurta said, his voice steady. "The Igigi'i are no more. Their ashes will scatter with the wind." Inanna, the goddess of war and love, leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. "And yet, their defiance has left a mark. Their rebellion, though futile, will be remembered. Tell me, Ninurta, did you fear them?" Ninurta's golden eyes met hers without hesitation. "I feared nothing, but I respected their strength. They fought not for power, but for freedom. That is a rare thing, even among the gods." The council fell silent. Enlil's expression hardened. "Respect for rebellion is dangerous, Ninurta. You have done your duty, but remember this. The gods must remain unchallenged. Mercy has no place in the heavens." Ninurta inclined his head but said nothing. In the quiet that followed the war, whispers of the Igigi'i rebellion lingered. Among the celestial workers who still toiled for the Anunnaki, stories spread of Kalzan and his defiance, of the fortress that stood against the storm, and of the fire that burned even in the face of annihilation. Though their rebellion had been crushed, their legacy refused to fade. Ninurta, too, felt its weight. In the solitude of his fortress, he often found his thoughts returning to Kalzan's final words, "Gods can bleed." Scherer, ever vigilant, would speak to him in those moments, urging him to cast aside such reflections. But the warlord, though victorious, was not unchanged. In the quiet of the storm's aftermath, he carried the memory of those who dared to stand against the heavens. The rebellion may have ended, but the story of the Igigi'i lives on. Their defiance, their courage, their unyielding spirit, these are the things that echo across time. If this story moved you, if it made you feel the fire of their fight or the weight of their struggle, then let's keep their legacy alive. Hit that like button to amplify their story, and leave a comment to share what part resonated with you the most. Your voice matters here, just as theirs did. And by subscribing, you ensure that tales like this, stories of courage and resilience, reach more people who need to hear them. Together, we can ensure that this story doesn't fade into the shadows. Share this video with someone who needs a spark of inspiration, and let's make this rebellion echo far beyond the heavens. Thank you for being part of this journey. Your support is the force that fuels these stories.